Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
They're outnumbered at close to 9-1 by the Chinese, and at the same time, they're running out of ammunition.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to Cold War history. Please make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. At Chosin in the Korean War, a US Army unit of 2,300 soldiers, a unit known as Task Force Faith, was overwhelmed by a Chinese force 8 times its size. Fighting with little ammunition support or food in temperatures that plunged to 35 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, more than 80% of the army soldiers were killed, captured or wounded. After the battle, they were falsely accused of throwing down their weapons and feigning wounds. Author Steve Fogel documents their brave fight in his new book called A Task Force Called Faith. I'm delighted to welcome Steve Fogel to our Cold War conversation.
There have been a lot of books about Chosin, and they've primarily focused on the 1st Marine Division, which was the primary major unit that was fighting under General Douglas MacArthur during the first months of the Korean War. What happened with the Army unit that was positioned on the east side of Chosin versus what happened to the Marines on the west side of Chosin are very different stories. And the Marine story is relatively well known, but the Army story I didn't know anything about, even though I thought I knew a lot about the Korean War, or at least as much as anybody interested in American or British military history. But when I was doing some stories for the Washington Post back in 2000 on the 50th anniversary of the war, somebody told me that the story of what happened to the Army unit at Chosin really hadn't been told. And I met some of the veterans who'd been there who fought with the Army unit, and they'd suffered a horrible tragedy, just largely decimated, but their story was largely unknown. And on top of that, they'd been accused of cowardice. And that's really what got me interested in the story. I wrote a story for the Washington Post back then about these guys, but I always thought there was more to tell about what had happened to them. And I stayed in touch with a lot of the veterans and their families, and had always wanted to come back to this, to give it a full look, a full story of what happened to them. And that's finally resulted. Now that we're at the 75th anniversary of the war, I finally managed to get it done. So that's why I've done this book.
It's an excellent book. Again, like you, I wasn't aware of this. I'd been aware of 1st Marine Division, but this is a fascinating and tragic story that really does need telling. And I'm really glad that you've covered this and we're able to share the story on Cold War Conversations. What is the strategic situation at this point in the Korean War? Where is Chosin Reservoir and why is it fought over?
Well, the first 6 months of the Korean War were one of the wildest back and forths, I think, of any major war, certainly in the last century. It's just an incredible series of reversals. The invasion had only happened about 5 months earlier, in late June of 1950, which caught the South Koreans and by extension the United States and its allies completely by surprise. So when North Korea invaded the South, they quickly were able to capture Seoul. Some initial American forces were sent in to reinforce the South Korean army, but they were quickly pushed back by the Soviet armed and trained North Korean army, which pretty quickly had the entire Allied force, UN forces that had come in at the order of Harry Truman and the UN Security Council, with the United States and Great Britain providing many of the troops, also Australia. They were quickly forced back to a little perimeter, just a toehold on the southeast coast of South Korea. And it looked like they were about to be pushed into the sea by the North Koreans. And then MacArthur, in September of 1950, just 2 months later, staged this remarkable amphibious landing at Incheon behind the enemy lines. And quickly, this force, which included the units that we write about in this book, the 1st Marine Division and the U.S. Army 7th Division, their landing near Seoul forced the collapse of the North Korean army, and they began being chased back across the border back into North Korea. So it looked like now this stunning reversal um, had left the MacArthur's UN forces back on the verge of victory. He had sent some of the units in pursuit of the North Koreans, and then he also sent the 1st Marine Division and the 7th Army Division back onto ships to stage another amphibious landing, this time on the West Coast into North Korea. And by the time that happened, you had winter starting to set in North Korea, which can be a very cold climate to start with. And this was a particularly cold winter in 1950. The North Koreans were being forced back to the Chinese border along the Yalu River. And MacArthur, despite some reservations back in Washington about pushing so close to the Yalu River, was determined to basically destroy the North Korean army, push up to the Yalu, and unify Korea under one government. And what happened as these forces, the 1st Marine Division and the 7th U.S. Army Division, moved to the Yalu, was that they were being drawn in. Mao Zedong, the new leader of the one-year-old People's Republic of China, was greatly alarmed by the approach of these UN forces to the Chinese border. And he had given out some warnings that the Americans should not approach, but they were largely ignored. And Mao and his Politburo decided that they were going to intervene on a large scale. And the strategy they had was to draw the Americans deep into the mountains of North Korea, and then they would cut off their access back to the sea and destroy them. And Chosin Reservoir was the perfect place to do this. Up in the highlands, surrounded by mountains, is a man-made reservoir there with just one road leading in. And the Chinese, in one of the really, truly remarkable military accomplishments of the 20th century, were able to infiltrate some 300,000 Chinese troops into North Korea with most of their presence disguised. MacArthur and the other UN allies knew there were Chinese operating in the area. There were some battles that had taken place, but the extent of the Chinese infiltration was vastly underestimated. And when the UN forces ended up on both sides of the Chosin Reservoir, that's when the Chinese launched their trap.
I think US intelligence estimate there's about 10% of the actual Chinese numbers
Right.
in that area. So they are really in for a shock. And Major General Ned Armand, he's the 10th Corps commander who's commanding the troops in this area. And he's absolutely dismissed the enemy, and he wants the glory of reaching the Yalu.
Yeah, that's right. He basically refused to believe what his own men were telling him. He's bound for glory. He with MacArthur's approval, had been pushing up towards the Yalu, and he didn't want this little hiccup to his vision of glory. So he refuses to believe what his commanders are telling him.
He starts dishing out silver stars, and Don Faith, who's one of the commanders, once Armand has left, just tears his off and throws it into the snow.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very dramatic moment, and it's just one of those moments that really, I think, crystallizes what's going on. Almond is more interested in just giving a little pep talk and handing out medals. In the meantime, these troops that have been sent up there, by the way, without adequate clothing for that type of weather, without adequate ammunition. This wasn't even a full-sized regiment that had been set up there. There were still some units that had not arrived. They were having trouble reaching this rather remote, rugged terrain up a Chosin Reservoir. They're in desperate straits, and Almond is handing out medals, and it's kind of one of these iconic moments, I think, that really sums up what happened at Chosin.
That initial encounter is the night of November 27th, 28th, and the temperatures were 35 degrees below zero. That's Fahrenheit, I'm assuming.
That's right. Yeah, it was unbelievably cold temperature. So the rifles are freezing up, canteens are freezing up. There's very little water for these soldiers to drink. They're having all kinds of trouble operating in this terrain, and actually almost even more critically, the batteries on their radios are freezing up, and the radios are dying and not functioning. So these units are cut off from the larger forces further south, and they can't even communicate amongst themselves. They're set up at different points along the shore of this rugged reservoir, and they are surrounded on all sides by a much larger force.
The scenes in the book that are described after that initial combat are quite horrifying. You know, hundreds of dead bodies lay everywhere, many frozen in grotesque poses, and the ground was too frozen for burial. It's horrific.
Yeah, absolutely. The U.S. Army and Marines at Chosin were fighting in essentially perhaps the coldest temperatures that any American unit had ever fought in, and we're including, of course, Valley Forge, the Battle of the Bulge. One exception would be some of the fighting during World War I up near the Arctic Circle. But these soldiers were absolutely not equipped for operating in that type of cold, and so you had a lot of soldiers on all sides that are freezing to death. Chinese forces that had been sent up were part of the Ninth Army Group, which was one of Mao's elite forces from the Red Army. They'd been sent up from around the Shanghai area, and a lot of them were dressed for subtropical weather. And then they'd been put on trains up to Manchuria and sent across the border, and they're wearing canvas shoes, in many cases lacking gloves. So on both sides of the fighting, you have soldiers who are really suffering under horrific conditions for anything, much less fighting a desperate battle.
So after Ned Armand's visit, Colonel McLean, who is in charge of the army units around Chosin, he's sort of got to make a decision as to how they're going to handle these attacks. So what is his response to that initial attack?
Well, they've been ordered by Almond to continue their attack north, which was ludicrous. They're already fighting for survival, but they stay in position, and they know another attack is going to come that second night, and it does, and it's just as relentless as the first night, just fighting all around the perimeters. Chinese were very good at infiltrating, and sometimes they would break through the lines and just run amok with burp guns, causing numerous casualties. They had managed to overrun some of the command posts, including one of the units that was used to control aerial attacks. So the Army unit was unable to call in airstrikes because of that problem. McLean, in the middle of that second night of fighting, confers with Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith, the battalion commander, and they agree that, regardless of what Almond said, they need to withdraw and consolidate with the rest of the Army unit that is about 4 miles south. And so they are able to successfully break off from the Chinese forces attacking on the northern end of the perimeter and move down to this inlet area where another infantry battalion is stationed along with some artillery units. And when they arrive, the sun is just coming up, and McLean is able to see a unit coming up the road toward that inlet position. He thinks it's one of his missing infantry battalions because he still doesn't have a full regiment there. And he's afraid that there's going to be a friendly fire incident, and he runs out onto the frozen inlet ice to try to, stop the firing that's going on between the units. But it was actually another Chinese column that was approaching, not any sort of American reinforcement. And so McLean is quickly shot, wounded, and taken prisoner, and disappears and isn't seen again. So now Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith is in command of the Army troops there, which number about 3,000.
So they're surrounded then at this point.
Yeah,
Is that
they're
correct?
consolidated largely into this one position in the inlet where they're surrounded by high ground on most of their perimeter, and then the frozen ice on the east side. So they're completely surrounded. And in fact, there's a tank company that's to the south that has tried several times to break through to reach them, but unsuccessfully unable to break through because the Chinese were able to throw up roadblocks on this one frozen road, and without infantry support, the tanks had just slid off the mountain road and were unable to break through to try to relieve the surrounded soldiers up at the inlet.
So now with Don Faith in command, the task force becomes Task Force Faith. What is the strength of Task Force Faith at this point, and what's the estimate of how many Chinese they were up against?
Yeah, at this point, the numbers of American troops in the inlet are probably around 2,800. After 2 nights, they've suffered hundreds of casualties, probably several hundred dead, and then many more who've been wounded and had to be put into trucks and brought back in the back of trucks to this surrounded inlet. They had managed to break through and join them there. Um, the Chinese force attacking them for the first 2 nights probably outnumbered them about 6-1. But for the third night, the Chinese decide, the who commands the Ninth Army Group feels that the Army unit is going to be easier to destroy than the Marines. They have an entire 2 Marine regiments on the other side of the Chosin Reservoir who number over 8,000 troops. The Army unit is much smaller, so he decides to concentrate his attack on the Army units on the east side. And for that third and fourth night of attacks, the Americans are being attacked by about 20,000 troops, and so they're outnumbered at close to 9-1 by the Chinese. And at the same time, they're running out of ammunition. When the Chinese attack at night, the Americans are unable to get any air support. So during the day, the Chinese kind of pull back into the mountains, and at night they're attacking, and in some cases breaking through into the perimeter. But each time, Faith sends out quick reaction forces to restore the perimeter. But all the while, they're taking more and more casualties, and pretty soon, Faith has close to 400 to 500 soldiers who are seriously wounded.
So the only option really for them is to try and fight their way back to, there's a town, I think, further south, which is sort of where the Marines are also retreating.
Yeah, Hagaru. It's really the key point for the entire Chosin Reservoir campaign, because it's at the southern tip of the reservoir, and it's at the top of the single road leading into Chosin. So any further American units that are able to reinforce have to come up that road into Hagaru. And if the Marines and the Army are to break out, they have to come out through Hagaru. And if the Chinese are able to take over the undermanned Marine garrison at Hagaru, that's going to be it. Basically, there's going to be no way out, and the Chinese will be able to destroy the entire 10th Corps forces that are up there at the reservoir.
Incredible. So Faith decides to start the breakout attempt on December the 1st, and they're putting wounded onto trucks, aren't they, to try and get them out as well. But the start of that breakout attempt, well, it's pretty disastrous, isn't it?
Yes. So at this point, Faith has about 600 wounded. After that fourth night of attacking, he's been given no orders one way or the other as to whether he should break out. But he's concluded that because they're just about out of all ammunition at this point, that there's no choice but to try to break out. And they're hoping that they'll be able to get air support from Marine Corsairs, which have been very effective against the Chinese during the daylight hours. So on the morning of December 1st, Faith orders all the trucks to be emptied of, all kinds of remaining kitchen supplies, tents, desks, whatever, to be tossed out. And they fit in 600 wounded soldiers into about 30 trucks. They only have about 30 trucks that are really functioning well enough to actually operate. The cold weather has disabled many of them, and of course our Chinese artillery and other fire has destroyed other trucks. So they have about 30 trucks crammed with wounded soldiers. The morning of December 1st is completely socked in. The clouds are down at the ground. There's snow flurries falling. They can't get any air support until it clears up. So the weather starts clearing at noon, and Corsairs are able to come in, and Faith orders the breakout to start. And this force of some 2,800 army soldiers starts fighting its way south, through a Chinese roadblock. They run into pretty heavy resistance quickly, and Faith asks for a Marine Corsair airstrike on a Chinese position, and a Corsair drops some napalm, which was a relatively new weapon, but very effective and terrifying against the Chinese. But this canister falls a bit short, and it falls on the front of the American breakout, and it envelops some 15 or 20 soldiers immediately, who were horribly burned, many of them killed. Others are able to still fight on despite horrendous wounds. So this immediately is a pretty disastrous start to the breakout. But they only have a few hours of daylight to move, so they continue fighting south. And the Chinese have been able to bring in another division to try to stop the Americans. So they have fresh regiments that are coming in to attack this very underarmed and pretty uncoordinated breakout attempt, because again, they have no radio contact between the units. They're spread out along the reservoir shore, and they're not able to get much support at all.
So they're on this road on the reservoir shore, and the Chinese are on the high ground, firing down on them all the time and
That's
blocking
right.
the road as they move forward.
Right. They set up several roadblocks, and then they blew out a bridge that the trucks would need in order to cross and continue south. So that this bridge delay, which happens around maybe 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, forces the convoy to back up as some of the trucks try to cross over this frozen terrain, going off the road, down a gully, across this frozen marsh. And some of the trucks, their tires break through the ice, and they're stuck. There is an American M19, which is an anti-aircraft tracked weapon that has no more ammunition, but is able to winch these trucks across the frozen stream one by one. And this takes several hours. In the meantime, the Chinese have another roadblock positioned at this hairpin curve. They control all the high ground and have machine gun nests firing at the approaching army convoy. And so again, the trucks are stuck on the road as the lead trucks are knocked out. But more Chinese troops are coming from the rear and attacking. They have Chinese on the hills atop them. It was just as horrible a situation as you can imagine. And the Corsairs overhead are trying to give as much support as they can, and that certainly helps. But then there are more friendly fire incidents. So it's a very grim situation.
Because the Chinese are closing in so close, it's hand-to-hand fighting at one point here. So they're actually Chinese troops climbing onto these trucks.
Yeah, they are. Some of the trucks in the rear are overrun. The Chinese were firing white phosphorus shells that set some of the trucks on fire. So wounded who are able to get out of the trucks are getting out and just crawling, trying to get away. You have the infantry and army soldiers who are trying to protect the flanks and the rear of the truck convoy, who are getting mowed down themselves by the Chinese fire. So some of the trucks are overrun, but all the desperate, incredible shellacking that the Americans are taking, they managed to attack up Hill 1221, which more or less commands the roadblock, and they disperse the Chinese who are holding those positions, taking terrible casualties as they do so. And finally, as darkness falls, they're able to clear out the Chinese roadblock and get the convoy moving again. But as part of that process, Lieutenant Colonel Faith, who was leading the attack on foot, just as they start clearing the roadblock, he's wounded by a Chinese grenade and very severely wounded and has to be carried back to one of the trucks. And Faith was this remarkably dynamic, courageous, who'd basically through force of will gotten them as far as they had. And with Faith now out of the picture, the situation is again grim, but with the roadblock cleared, the lead trucks of the convoy are able to get through, and there's still some hope, at least among the troops at the front, that they're going to be able to get out.
Incredible's too mild a word for this. I mean, the efforts that they're trying to make to get through these Chinese blocks and back to link up with the Marines is immense. And you've got some great personal quotes in here of people who were there. And one of the ones that stood out for me was Corporal Doc Bloom. And he describes the Chinese actions after they overrun the tail end of the convoy. And the Chinese climbed onto the trucks loaded with wounded, then shot and bayoneted helpless men. It was murder, pure and simple. Just indescribable what's happening there. So how many of Task Force Faith actually make it through these Chinese blocks?
Well, after they've broken through the roadblock at Hill 1221, they come down. Lead trucks make it down to another bridge that's been blown, but the American soldiers accompanying the trucks, they find a nearby railroad trestle bridge that the trucks can just barely make their way across and continue. At this point, the number of Americans who were still able to fight had greatly diminished. Many had been killed in the fighting to get to that point, going up Hill 1221. Some of the soldiers had headed out to the ice already. Others are, as they are continuing down south with the trucks, they can see a Chinese regiment on a hill overlooking the road. And as they approach, the Chinese begin firing and knock out the lead trucks blocking the road. And at this point, the task force pretty much disintegrates. I mean, the Chinese have essentially an open field of fire now. They're just launching rockets and machine gun fire into these trucks, overrunning them. The Americans who have stayed to fight are largely killed or captured. Many of the wounded are trying to crawl away, and a surprising number of them are able to make it to the ice or to various huts, villages where the North Korean civilians lived, and they're in many cases taken in by North Korean civilians who hide them in barns and huts. The Chinese are primarily focused on destroying the trucks, and in the end, probably about 1,000 GIs have been killed in the attack. Another 1,000 have eventually make it to Hagaru. Some of them, it takes days for them to get there. They're being rescued by the Marines, by other Army soldiers who have made it to Hagaru. And the Chinese at this point are largely not too focused on killing the survivors. They've kind of turned a blind eye to many of the rescue attempts, because now the focus is returning to attacking the Marines on the west side of the reservoir. So it's a remarkable rescue effort that goes on for several days. North Korean civilians are bringing in some of these horrifically wounded GIs in the back of sleds or in carts. The Army and Marines send up some tanks to bring other GIs back to Hagaru. Meantime, an airstrip has finally been completed at Hagaru, and they're able to start flying out some of the wounded soldiers and Marines. So about 1,000 Army soldiers are evacuated via these evacuation flights. And then you have about 385 GIs who make it out of the inlet through the breakout and who make it back to Hagaruri and are able to continue fighting. There's several other hundred more American GIs who were further south, weren't trapped at the inlet, who also are part of this force. And you then get the Marines are able to break out against the Chinese roadblocks on the west side, and they make it back. Probably more than 7,000 of them make it back. They've suffered hundreds of casualties as well. But then at this point, you have a large American force that's consolidated at Hagaruri, and now they're still going to have to fight their way out of the mountains and back to the sea.
So they're not completely out the woods at this point, because a fighting retreat is one of the most difficult military maneuvers to carry out. How do they fare in their retreat back to the sea?
Well, in many ways, this is when the press is finally able to make it into Hagaruri, and the state of the Marines and the Army was pretty shocking to the reporters who arrived there. They also have the Royal Marine Commandos, who are part of a force that's been set up to the town of Kodori, which is a key point on the road back to the sea, and they've bolstered the Marine First Regiment, which is holding that key town. And some of them have fought their way up as part of Task Force Drysdale, which was by a Royal Marine Commando, Colonel Drysdale. That these Marines, Royal Marines, proved to be a real key to bolstering the 10th Corps force that's up there in the mountains. And at this point, the thing is, the Chinese have been horrifically decimated by the attacks. Now, Task Force Faith, as it became known, had essentially been destroyed, but in the process, they had essentially almost destroyed an entire Chinese division, the 80th, and badly damaged another, the 81st. So these two divisions were largely combat ineffective at that point, and they could not join these attacks against the retreat. They hadn't been able to capture Hagaruri, and now they weren't able to really put up that much resistance once this combined force of Marines and soldiers begins moving down out of Chosin down to Kodori. And once they reach Kodori by December 8th, the feeling was the Chinese were not going to be able to stop them. They are not able to put up nearly as much of an attack as they'd been doing earlier in the fighting. They've suffered so many casualties. The Marines had inflicted terrible casualties on other Chinese divisions on the west side of the reservoir, and now that they were completely exhausted, and the Marines are actually well supplied. They've got a lot of ammunition at Kodori. They're getting supply from the air, so the Americans now have the advantage. And once they reach Kodori, they're able to continue south. And the closer they get to the sea, the less the resistance there is. The Chinese are basically a defeated force now. The biggest drama was a bridge that had been blown over this huge chasm and this part of the pass that's leading up to the reservoir. So if they aren't able to get out, they still might be trapped. But the Americans drop a treadway bridge, pretty remarkable operation just by itself, that they're able to use to bridge over this gully, and they're able to continue the march south. And by December 11th, the forces have reached the safety of the American perimeter at Hungnam.
Wow. It's good to hear the Royal Marines come in and help out as well there in the story.
I've met some of them because they come to the reunions of the chosen few, and they're always a jaunty and very well respected group. There's a real bond, particularly between the U.S. Marines and the Royal Marines who fought there, that still exists to this day.
Brilliant. That's really good to hear. As we sort of said when we started this episode, the story of the 1st Marine Division sort of shapes the story of the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. How was Task Force Faith remembered after the Korean War?
Well, the 1st Marine Division under Major General O.P. Smith had pulled off one of the most remarkable retreats. They don't even like to call it a retreat. They just called it attacking in a different direction.
Brilliant.
And they were rightly lauded as heroes. This Marine division, which was probably one of the finest that has existed in any war, had pulled off something that would become legendary. It became legendary almost immediately in Marine Corps history, just considered one of those proud moments like Belleau Woods during the World War I or Iwo Jima in World War II. And they were rightly saluted as heroes. They sailed back, and joined the forces back in South Korea. And many of the press, some of the, the great reporters of the day, like Maggie Higgins and Homer Bigart, had, wrote these stories lauding the Marines. And, this atmosphere of celebration continues to this day, essentially, about the legendary 1st Marine Division at Chosin Reservoir, and rightly so. But with the Army unit at Task Force Faith, what happened with them was, for one thing, they had suffered 85% casualties. They'd been essentially decimated. The survivors who made it back to Hagaruri, which included not many officers, because most of the officers had been killed, were in such pathetic shape after 4 nights of this horrific fighting that many of them were flown out. They weren't much of a fighting unit anymore, and these rumors began spreading among the Marines who saw these survivors coming in, and just in general, that the Army unit must not have put up much of a fight. Essentially, that these stories started spreading that the officers tried to flee to the rear. They abandoned their men. They fled as soon as the Chinese showed up, dropped their weapons. And there was a Navy chaplain who was with the Marines who wrote an article that was published in the United States that essentially said, the Army unit, in contrast to our heroic, brave Marines, they were a bunch of cowards. They didn't face much of a Chinese opposition. It wasn't any kind of large units they were facing. This story spread like wildfire in the United States. There were hearings. The story was carried in many newspapers and magazines. Investigations were ordered, and that story was spread. And it was largely untrue. I mean, there were soldiers who did not perform heroically, but there are many others who gave their lives trying to get their wounded comrades out. The stories of heroism that you can read in the book. I mean, there's so many that, as one of the soldiers who was there said, heroism became like just a common thing. There were so many heroic acts of sacrifice of people knowing they're very likely to be killed, but trying to fight to get their wounded comrades out, who sacrificed their lives. But there was no one really who was there, who made it back, who was able to, tell the story of what had happened, because most of those soldiers were evacuated and their story was not heard. Officers, there were no official reports really written of what happened with the unit. So this stain of cowardice hung over the unit. Now, the investigations showed that these charges were largely unfounded. I mean, the idea that officers fled to the rear in jeeps was just so ludicrous, because there wasn't a single vehicle from Task Force Faith that made it out. So it wasn't as if the officers, just drove back in jeeps and left their men there. That was just an asinine. And then the allegation that, well, they didn't have many Chinese attacking them was also completely false. And in fact, the 9-to-1 odds that the Task Force Faith fought against the last 2 nights that was a larger ratio than any other unit, including any of the Marine units, faced at Chosin Reservoir. So they faced unbelievable odds. Also, the Chinese units that suffered the most casualties at Chosin were the ones that the Army units had been fighting against, the 80th in particular. No division suffered more damage than the 80th Chinese division. So nonetheless, this pall of shame essentially hangs over Task Force Faith. And General O.P. Smith, the Marine commander, who was a remarkable commander and just one of the real reasons the Marines were able to make it out, thanks to his, deliberate, cautious, um, decisions, against the wishes of General Ned Almond or General MacArthur. He was the main reason the Marines were able to make it out, but he had a very low opinion of these Army soldiers. He heard the same rumors, and there were these allegations that a lot of the GIs who made it out were faking their injuries, which was ridiculous. The pilots who flew these men out say that so many of them died on the flight back to Japan that the ones who actually survived was much lower than the ones who were actually flown out. So it was all these allegations, and the Marine General O.P. Smith decided to remove them from the Presidential Unit Citation, which was given to the 1st Marine Division. The units of Task Force Faith were initially added by the Army to this citation, but General Smith removed them, and so the mark of shame was on them for over half a century. And it wasn't until around the year 2000, at the 50th anniversary, which is when I first became aware of this story, that a band of survivors began telling the story of what had really happened, and they worked to correct the record, and eventually the Marine Corps and Navy agreed that they had been unfairly left off this citation, and they added the units of the 31st Regimental Combat Team, i.e. Task Force Faith, to the Presidential Unit Citation.
Wow. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Too late for a lot of the veterans, I guess, as well.
Sadly, absolutely.
One of the things I really enjoy about the book is you've got some great first-hand accounts, and I think one that sort of sums up the bitterness of the veterans of Task Force Faith in how they've been treated is one you've got from Sergeant Joe Ager, where he says, "So I wish that the record is set straight about those of us east of Chosin. We fought to the very end." And there's another one which I thought was particularly poignant, which was a Task Force Faith veteran visiting the Punch Bowl in Hawaii. His name's Bob Hammond, and he's looking at the names of the missing on the Korean War Memorial there, and realizes that his whole squad is listed. He was the only one that had made it out, and he didn't know it. He didn't know that until that point.
Right. Yeah. The circumstances of the end of Task Force Faith were such that most of these guys don't know what happened to their comrades, and in some cases until years later, when they finally began holding some reunions in the 1980s and 90s. Joe Ager, I saw him actually just about 2 weeks ago because I spoke at the Chosen Few, which is the organization of surviving veterans, and he was the only Army survivor who still there. But he spoke out at this gathering several times, saying, "We need the true story to be told." And so it was great to see him still fighting to get that story out. So yeah, it's I think recognition is finally coming to what these men did, what they went through, the sacrifices they made, and the conclusion now, that something that I argue in the book, is that if it hadn't been for the stand that Task Force Faith made over those 4 nights, essentially tying up 2 Chinese divisions and parts of others, Hagaruri likely would have fallen, and all of 10th Corps up at Chosin would likely have been destroyed. So the scale of the disaster would have been far worse than what it was. So I think hopefully this story will help correct the record, that it wasn't just the Marines who were responsible for the escape from Chosin, that the Army played a critical role as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm pleased that Cold War Conversations can amplify this story. We've talked in detail here about the circumstances of this action, but there is far more detail in the book. And I think one of the things that I found almost most poignant is Don Faith was killed in that final breakout, and his body is lost until 2012. Do you want to tell the story of that, Steve?
Yeah, I mean it's a really remarkable part of the story that I included in the final sections of the book. But essentially, most of those who were killed up at Chosin remained there for decades until uh, the 1990s, when there was a bit of a rapprochement between the United States and North Korea, and some limited excavations began up at Chosin in 2001, where joint North Korean and U.S. military teams worked, dug around the inlet at Hill 1221, many of the key battlegrounds up there, and began recovering remains. And those excavations went on for several years, including at one point accompanied by a couple of the veterans from Chosin that were the first Americans back at that reservoir in over half a century. But it took a while with the DNA sampling, and there were some remains that were recovered in 2004. Were almost the final ones that were recovered at that point, because the excavations ended in 2005 amid escalating tensions between North Korea and the United States. But these remains that were discovered in 2004 were in 2012. They were identified as belonging to Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith, based on DNA that had been supplied by his daughter, who had been 4 years old at the time he died. And I met her several times. He had been posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions, and his funeral at Arlington National Cemetery was a very emotional event. And she was there. There were some other survivors from the Task Force Faith who were there, a number of battalion commanders from the United States Army who had subsequently commanded the 1st Battalion of the 32nd Regiment, which was then part of the 10th Mountain Division fighting in Afghanistan. They attended the funeral. And yeah, it was hard to believe that at this point, more than 60 years after the battle, that Don Faith, this pretty legendary American officer, had come back. And that wasn't the end of the story, because it would continue in the years that followed. There were some more remains that were turned over by North Korea in 2018. And again, it's taken some years, but in the last couple of years, many of these remains have been found to belong to the Army soldiers who are east of Chosin. So it seems like almost once a month you have another identification being made. And I've attended a number of these funerals that have been in this area, at Arlington National Cemetery, or in Maryland, Virginia, places in this region where families 75 years later are finally getting remains back. In many cases, one in Maryland that I went to several years ago, Roy DeLauter, who had been 22 when he died at Chosin, he came back, I think it was 3 years ago now. His older sister was still alive, Buddy, as she called him, and she, cried on his casket. His 2 daughters, who'd been 1 and 2 years old when he died, were there as well. And, this was a small little town in Maryland, and you had half the town there. You had all the police and fire departments, standing at attention. Really remarkable tribute to these men decades and decades after they died. And this is continuing to this day. And finally, some of these men are returning home and getting some recognition for the sacrifices they made.
Yeah. Wow. That's an incredible story. Do you know how the Chinese remember this battle? Because they suffered immense losses as well as the US.
Yeah. And, Mao, who celebrated the victory when he got the news that the Army regiment had been destroyed, he was just ecstatic. But, a few weeks later, he starts getting the casualty reports. And they had lost 40% of their combat strength in the 9th Army Group, which was like his elite force. This was the force that he'd been planning to send to Taiwan, to Formosa, to finish off the Civil War and end the nationalist presence that, of course, continues to this day. They didn't invade Taiwan. Instead, they were sent to North Korea, and they were unable to fight again for another 6 months. So Mao, was pretty heavy-hearted. In fact, I think those are the words he used. My heart is heavy at at these dismaying casualties. And at the same time, it's very interesting today that China, unlike we're in the United States, where the Korean War is largely forgotten, the Korean War is very much remembered in China, because this was kind of a sort of a coming out party for Mao, who was the entry of the new People's Republic of China onto the public stage. That Mao wanted to make sure that the world knew the Chinese were not a paper tiger. And though they suffered, terrible casualties, it's part of the mystique now of the People's Republic of China. And even now, the Chinese Communist government has been, as part of this approach of the 75th anniversary of Chosin, has made a big deal out of Chosin. It was actually a movie commissioned several years ago by the Chinese government, became one of the biggest blockbusters in Chinese history, and it tells the story from a very different perspective. It has the Chinese defending Korea from invaders, because the idea is that the Americans were planning to invade China, and that it was South Korea that had started the war, not North Korea. So they kind of rewrite the story of the aggressor who began that war. But it's part of the Chinese government's, I think, strategy now, is to use Chosin and the Korean War as a rallying point for Chinese nationalism. That we stood up to the Americans then, and our soldiers who fought there were heroes, and it's definitely remembered in a different way in China than it is in the United States.
I think they describe it as the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea.
Exactly.
That's nice and snappy, that title. Are there any movies that do center on Chosin apart from that Chinese film?
Well, there was an American movie that was made that began production by Warner Brothers within a month of the battle ending, because as we discussed, this heroic story of the Marines coming out, really captured the attention, the imagination of Americans. It was just, this incredible feat, surrounded by this enormous Chinese army, that they were able to march out proudly and make it back.
So it's a bit like the Alamo, but with a better ending.
Right. Yeah, exactly. They made it out, and it was like, the name of the movie was Retreat Hell, which was a quote that O.P. Smith was supposedly said when asked by a British reporter during the battle, like, are you planning to retreat down to Kotori? And O.P. Smith was reported to have said, "Retreat hell, we're attacking in opposite direction." So he didn't say that actually, but that became the famous from Chosin. So this movie was called Retreat Hell, and it focused entirely on the Marines, and in fact it made no mention at all of the U.S. Army. So this was the way that the battle was portrayed to the American public, that this was a heroic episode in Marine Corps history, which it most certainly is and remains, should be one of the proudest moments in Marine Corps history. But the full story wasn't told, and what happened to the Army unit, to Task Force Faith on the east side of the reservoir, is a story that was little known at the time, and to the extent it was soon entirely forgotten. And it's part of that story. It should be part of the legend. It's not as glorious by any means as what the Marines pulled off, but it was a story of sacrifice and bravery and tragedy that I think more people should be aware about.
You have been listening to Steve Fogel, the author of A Task Force Called Faith, the untold story of the US Army soldiers who fought for survival at the Chosin Reservoir and honour back home. There are links in the episode information where you can buy the book and support the podcast. As I said earlier, we've only scratched the surface here, so there's loads more detail in the book, so please purchase it and support Cold War Conversations. The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.